The boy stood barefoot on frozen gravel, clutching a trash bag like a life raft, while a wall of motorcycles idled behind him, and his stepmother screamed his name from the darkened porch, and I knew, before anyone spoke, that whatever line had been crossed tonight could never be uncrossed. Moments like this don't happen by accident. They're the final spark after years of quiet damage. And if stories about chosen family, justice without cruelty, and adults finally doing the right thing matter to you, tap like and subscribe now because this one starts dark, but it goes somewhere worth following. Weeks earlier, long before the engines or the shouting, before the smell of gasoline mixed with fear, there was just a small house at the edge of town and a 10-year-old boy named Eli who had learned to fold his life small enough to survive inside it. And I watched it happen the way neighbors do, through patterns rather than confessions. The way he wore the same gray hoodie no matter the weather, sleeves burned and stiff at the cuffs. The way he washed his socks in the school bathroom sink and dried them under the hand dryer. The way he flinched whenever someone joked about campfires or backyard grills. Eli lived with his father and stepmother, Kara, a woman who smiled wide in public and collected silence in private. And when his mother died 2 winters earlier, the house seemed to shrink around him. His father working late shifts and coming home exhausted while Kara took over the small, cruel details of raising a child she resented. And it began innocently enough if you didn't know how to look. Clothes disappearing from Eli's room, one shirt at a time, explanations offered like jokes. You left it on the floor, it smelled, it got ruined in the wash. And then one afternoon the wind shifted and carried the unmistakable scent of burning fabric down the block, and I saw Eli standing rigid by the fence, watching smoke curl out of a rusted fire pit in the yard, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for impact. Kara poking at the flames with a stick, humming, telling anyone who might ask that she was just cleaning up. By winter, Eli owned 3 outfits and wore them in rotation like armor. And when kids at school teased him, he didn't fight back. He learned the math of survival early. Attention led to questions, questions led home, and home was where the fire lived. And the worst part wasn't the loss of things. It was the ceremony of it. Kara making him watch sometimes, holding up a sleeve or a sneaker and asking if he'd learned yet, whatever lesson she needed him to absorb that day, while his father slept on the couch or stared through his phone like the world couldn't reach him. And I remember the night it escalated because the sound was different, not the soft whoosh of flames, but a sharp crack, as if something inside finally snapped. And Eli came running down the street with no coat, a trash bag slung over his shoulder, eyes fixed forward like he'd already decided not to look back. The clubhouse sat 3 miles away, a place most people avoided, and Eli had never been inside. But kids notice things adults pretend not to. Who makes noise that scares bullies? Who shows up when someone's in trouble? Who protects without asking for thanks? And when Eli reached the door, his hands were shaking so badly, he could barely knock. And when it opened, the room fell quiet in a way that wasn't hostile but alert, as if every man inside recognized the shape of fear before it spoke. And Eli didn't cry, he didn't dramatize, he just said, "She burns my clothes when she's bored." Like it was a fact about the weather. And that was the moment the story truly began, because silence moved through that room like a command. Phones came out. A medic crouched to check his hands. Small burns, old blisters, skin too rough for a child. And someone draped a jacket over his shoulders without asking. And I watched the men listen the way professionals do, not interrupting, not filling gaps, letting the truth land where it needed to. And when they walked him back to that house later, it wasn't with threats or fists, but with witnesses, with cameras, with a social worker on the line, and a neighbor, me, standing close enough to hear Kara's voice rise and fall as the story she'd rehearsed collapsed under details she couldn't explain. And Eli stood between 2 bikes, trash bag still clenched in his hand, while his father finally looked at him like he was seeing him for the first time. And the fire pit sat cold in the yard, blackened and empty, waiting to be photographed, waiting to testify. And as engines rumbled to life and the night seemed to hold its breath, I realized this wasn't just about a child escaping cruelty. It was about what happens when harm is met not with more harm, but with resolve, with community, with the refusal to look away. And that was only the first night. Part 1 of a chain reaction that would pull hidden truths into the open, force choices long avoided, and test whether protection, once offered, could truly become a home. By the time the sun came up, the street looked ordinary again, which is always the strangest part after something terrible is exposed. Trash cans lined up neatly, frost melting off windshields, birds making noise like nothing had happened. But inside the system that had finally been triggered, nothing was ordinary anymore. And I knew part 2 of this story would be about consequences, the kind that arrive slowly, methodically, and without the drama people expect. Eli spent that first morning at the clubhouse kitchen table wrapped in an oversized flannel. Sipping cocoa he kept forgetting to drink, answering the same gentle questions from a social worker who didn't rush him and didn't doubt him either. And every answer added weight to a case that had been waiting years to exist. Photos of the fire pit taken at dawn, ash sifted to reveal metal snaps and zipper teeth, school records showing repeated notes about inappropriate clothing for weather, a nurse's log documenting small burns Eli never complained about. And when Kara was brought in for questioning, she laughed at first, the same laugh I'd heard over the fence, the one that tried to turn cruelty into comedy, until the timeline closed in on her and the laughter ran out of room. Eli's father arrived late, disoriented and defensive, insisting there had to be a misunderstanding, that Kara was strict but meant well. And it was Eli who ended that illusion quietly by asking, if it was an accident, why did she make me watch? The room went still after that, because there are questions that don't need follow-ups, only space to be heard. CPS moved faster than usual, partly because the evidence was physical and undeniable, partly because witnesses had stepped forward in numbers Kara couldn't intimidate, and partly because Eli never wavered. He didn't embellish or minimize. He simply told the truth like someone who'd rehearsed it alone too many times. And by afternoon, a temporary protective order was issued. Kara removed from the home pending investigation, and Eli placed under emergency care with a vetted guardian connected to the same network that had opened the clubhouse door, not as a favor, not as a shortcut, but as a legal, documented step toward stability. What struck me most wasn't the paperwork or the interviews, it was the shift in Eli's body language, how his shoulders slowly lowered, how he stopped bracing for footsteps, how he slept for 6 straight hours in a spare room with clean sheets, and a door that locked from the inside. And when he woke, he asked if it was okay to keep the clothes he'd been given, as if they might vanish if he wanted them too badly. The men from the clubhouse didn't hover or posture. They set boundaries instead. Rides to school coordinated with officials, check-ins scheduled, court dates noted on calendars like any other responsibility. And when word spread, as it always does in small towns, the reactions were predictable and revealing. Some neighbors expressed shock, others guilt. A few tried to rewrite history by claiming they'd always suspected. But the only opinion that mattered belonged to a 10-year-old learning what safety felt like in real time. Kara's narrative unraveled quickly once she couldn't control the setting. Friends distanced themselves. Explanations contradicted earlier statements. And when confronted with the pattern, selective destruction, public charm, private humiliation, there was nowhere left to hide. While Eli's father faced a quieter reckoning, one without handcuffs but heavier in some ways, as he was forced to confront how absence can be a form of participation, and the court ordered counseling not as punishment, but as a condition of any future contact, a chance to decide whether he would finally choose his child over convenience. The fire pit was removed from the yard 2 days later, hauled away like evidence and like a symbol, leaving a bare patch of ground that looked oddly small for the damage it had done, and Eli asked to watch it go, not with satisfaction but with curiosity, as if confirming that something which had ruled his world could, in fact, be lifted and taken away. By the end of the week, he returned to school in new boots and a jacket that fit, and when a classmate joked about his glow-up, Eli didn't laugh or shrink. He just said, "I got help," like that was a normal thing kids did, and maybe someday it will be. Part 2 wasn't about revenge or spectacle. It was about systems finally working the way they were designed to, about adults being held to standards children shouldn't have to beg for, and about the slow replacement of fear with routine. Homework at the same table every night, clothes folded without urgency, warmth that didn't come from flames. And as I watched Eli walk past my house that Friday afternoon, head up, trash bag gone, I understood that the hardest part was already behind him, but the most important part was still ahead. Because surviving is one thing, and learning to live without expecting harm is another. And that lesson would take time, patience, and a kind of protection that doesn't fade when the engines go quiet. By the time the case reached its final hearing, spring had settled into the town like a cautious promise. And I could tell this conclusion wouldn't be loud or cinematic, but earned in the way real endings usually are, through consistency, accountability, and the quiet rebuilding of trust. Eli sat in the courtroom wearing a button-down that still smelled faintly of laundry soap, feet not quite touching the floor, swinging slightly as he waited his turn, and when he spoke it wasn't with anger or fear but with the calm precision of someone who had finally been believed, explaining the fires, the watching, the rules that changed without warning, and the way silence had felt safer than asking for help until it didn't anymore. And when the judge listened, really listened, the decision followed with a clarity that left no room for reinterpretation. Kara was barred from contact, required to complete mandated counseling and community service tied to child abuse prevention, and formally charged for documented neglect, while Eli's father, after months of court-ordered therapy and verified change, was granted supervised visitation only, contingent on continued progress and Eli's consent, a condition that shifted power where it always should have been. The permanent guardianship was awarded to the couple who had taken Eli in that first week, not because they were saviors, but because they were steady, the kind of people who kept promises small and frequent. And when the gavel fell, Eli didn't smile or cry. He just exhaled, a long breath that seemed to empty something old from his chest. Life didn't transform overnight after that. And that's what made the change real. There were still bad dreams, still moments when the smell of smoke made his hands curl into fists, but there were also new rituals that slowly overrode the old ones, like shopping for clothes without rushing, choosing colors just because he liked them, learning that nothing bad happened if he owned more than he needed. And on the first warm evening of the year, the clubhouse hosted a cookout that wasn't a celebration so much as a marker of normalcy. Grills instead of fire pits, laughter instead of vigilance, and Eli running with other kids until his face was flushed from play rather than fear. I watched him sit on the curb later, peeling the label off a soda bottle, and someone asked if he was okay, and he nodded and said, "I'm just thinking about how quiet it is now. Not the dangerous quiet of before, but the kind that lets you hear yourself think." And it struck me then that healing doesn't announce itself. It shows up in comments like that, in the absence of alarms. His father continued therapy, sometimes showing up awkward and unsure for supervised visits, sometimes not showing up at all, and Eli was allowed to decide how much of that he could handle, a choice that mattered more than any apology. While Kara faded from the story the way people do when they lose control of the narrative, reduced to paperwork and consequences and the knowledge that what she'd done would follow her far longer than the flames ever lasted. As months passed, Eli grew into himself, taller, steadier, joining a school club, bringing friends home without anxiety, learning that adults could disagree without someone getting hurt. And one afternoon I saw him carrying a box toward the donation center. Inside were clothes he'd outgrown, and when I asked if he was sure he wanted to give them away, he shrugged and said, "Someone else might need them." Not with obligation, but with generosity. The clearest sign yet that he no longer believed the world was a zero-sum game. The story people will tell about this will focus on the night of engines and confrontation, because that's what photographs well, but the real ending lives in quieter frames. Folded laundry, court forms signed and honored, a child sleeping through the night without rehearsing escape routes. And as Eli walked past my house one last time, before summer, backpack slung easily over his shoulder, he waved, a small, ordinary gesture that felt monumental, because it meant he was no longer carrying the weight of being unseen. And in that moment, I understood the true conclusion of this story wasn't justice alone, but the proof that cruelty doesn't get the final word when people choose to notice, to act, and to stay long after the smoke clears.